Thank you for joining me, everyone. Cheers. For those who do not know me yet, my name is Ron Levine from Mindfulness in Blue Jeans. I've been practicing mindfulness and insight meditation for 24 years. And I was introduced to the practice during a time when I was dealing with clinical anxiety and depression and a raging panic disorder that had blown up into agoraphobia. So I was unable to leave the house. I was on disability. My life effectively stopped. And I was fortunate enough to be paired up with a psychologist who, even back in 1998, was already several decades deep into practicing and teaching mindfulness and insight meditation. And he offered me these tools and techniques as a way of dealing with what I was going through. I was not thrilled with his suggestion. My feeling was, hey, I can't work, I can't go out, I can't do anything. And here's this guy saying, hey, why don't you sit and watch the breathing for a while, see what happens. Right? Great. Okay. Thanks, I guess. Maybe. I figured, all right, I'm going to try this, give it an honest shot just long enough that I can go back to him and say, look, dude, this didn't work. Can I have the real treatment now? And as I say, that was 24 years ago, and I never did have that conversation with him. I'm still practicing. Now I'm teaching. Maybe there's something to it all. And here we are. So thank you for being with me. This talk is called Shattering Attachment. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what I mean by attachment and the cycle that attachment forms. What I mean by shattering the cycle. And how we can apply what I call shatter points. This concept of shatter points that I'll talk about, to 3 separate levels of attachment. And then we'll practice for a bit and have a little time for Q&A at the end. Okay? So, attachment. What do I mean by attachment? Attachment is something we hear about a lot in spiritual circles, particularly in Buddhism. Much of what I teach and study comes from Theravada Buddhism. And what the Buddha taught was only one thing, which is how do we alleviate our suffering? Not our pain. Pain is that thing we don't have a choice about. We're going to experience pain in this life. Discomfort. It's going to happen. Suffering is what we experience when we don't deal with pain skillfully, effectively, wisely. Okay? One of the issues that we have as humans, these fortunate beasts that we are, is we are hardwired for dissatisfaction. You ever notice how we don't like it when things change, but we get bored when they stay the same? Kind of can't win, huh? We are hardwired for dissatisfaction. Our ancestors, who were not satisfied with the amount of safety they had managed to get from the proverbial saber-toothed tiger, not satisfied with the amount of food they had managed to get. The ones who were most anxious about their situation, well, they are the ones who survived. The ones who were being extra careful, right? So this was a survival trait. This dissatisfaction. And this sense of dissatisfaction is what is often referred to in Buddhism as craving. This internal feeling of things need to be other than they are. Clinging is what we do with our target of our craving. So to take a very obvious example, we have a dissatisfaction of, say, feeling of hunger, and we see a piece of food. Clinging is what occurs when we have now focused our attention on a target that we desire in an attempt to alleviate that craving. And we develop an identification around that. This is one of the ways that we develop an identification early in life. there's all of these cravings, all of these desires, and what naturally comes along with those kinds of processes, but a storyline, a thought process that says, well, there's this wanting here. Who wants? Who's wanting? I must be wanting. I mean, if there's wanting, there must be a wanter, right? I want that. And then maybe we get it. It's like, well, I have that. That's mine, right? And don't you take it from me, right? We start to develop an identity around what we want, what we have, what we don't want, what we don't want to lose, right? Because as humans, we have an aversion to loss. I remember back in my psychology days learning about the aversion to loss that we have as humans. We would rather not get something that we want than lose something that we have. Right? Oh, that's mine. Don't take that from me. It's like losing a part of our identity. Again, survival mechanism. Because if we lost something out in the African savannah 50,000 years ago, that could be death, right? So when we're talking about attachment, I'm talking about this grasping, this clinging to, I mean, it could be a physical object. It could be a concept. It could be a belief, right? It could be a feeling. And we're going to talk about that in depth in a bit. What's interesting is when we grasp or cling to things in the physical world, we let go when they're no longer needed, right? You slip on the stairs and you grab onto the railing. Once you regain your balance, we don't have a problem letting go of the railing, right? But we don't do that with our minds, do we? When we start grasping, start clinging to something in our minds, I want that, I need that. We don't let that go, do we? And why is this? Well, there's a whole handful of reasons, but just a couple off the top of my head. We develop these storylines about these target objects, which again, may not be a physical object, but we develop these storylines about them. Again, this identification that we form around them based on what the Buddha might call delusion, what we might consider a misperception. For example, we think of things as being constant, unchanging. Well, that's my car. That's how it is, and yeah, that's how it's going to stay. Or it's better be how it stays, right? We think that a particular thing is always going to be the way that it is when, we first see it, we first think about it. When we get into a relationship and it's wonderful, it's like, oh, well, it's always going to be this way. Right? It's always going to be like this. It's constant, right? It's not changing. And of course, everything is changing. I mean, if you look at something that may appear static to us under a microscope at a high enough definitions, you're going to see pretty quickly it's not constant. It is inconstant. There is a lot of movement. There's a lot of activity. So there's this perceived constancy of the things that we want. And there's also selective attention. We look at the upsides of getting the thing. Don't think about the downsides, right? My favorite example is, somebody wants to get a dog and they think about all the times they'll be out playing in the sunshine and having fun and romping around. Never think about the time when the dog's going to take a crap on the rug in the house, right? We don't think about that. No, it's all going to be great. We're just looking at one part, the part that we want. The main point is this. Based on things like perceived constancy, selective attention, this identification. We believe that this target, again, whether it's a physical object, a relationship, money, what have you, we believe that the object of this clinging will bring us a lasting happiness. Which means any effort that we have to go to get it and keep it must be worth it. So, hey, lasting happiness, right? We think we're going to get a return on our investment, so to speak. So an interesting cycle forms out of this. The clinging that initially arises from that craving to have things be other than they are, and the attempt to get the thing that we think will solve that problem, that will bring us that happiness. Both of these are thwarted, are doomed to fail by the inconstancy of things. And not just the inconstancy of the thing that we have fixated upon. That's not the only thing that's going to change. And in fact, that's the least important thing that's going to change. The other thing that's going to change is our feelings. Our feelings about that thing. The Buddha once said that if there was a mountain made of gold, doubled it would not be enough to satisfy a single person. Again, we are hardwired for dissatisfaction. So we might get that relationship. Does it bring pure, lasting happiness in and of itself? People win the lottery. How does that end? Often not well. Sometimes I say that the quickest way to meet your demons is to not get what you want. And the second quickest way is to get it. Because even if we get what we want, we might be happy for a little bit, and then that dissatisfaction starts to creep in again. So we have our original dissatisfaction, and now we have this new dissatisfaction arising from the fact that we couldn't solve our original dissatisfaction, which creates more clinging. Because now we have two dissatisfactions to try to solve. And now we've started a cycle, haven't we? And that cycle continues to repeat. Because we are so caught up in the content of it. We are so caught up in these storylines. We are so caught up in this identification. And all of the resulting dissatisfaction and suffering that is arising. Remember, I said what the Buddha taught was, how do we alleviate our suffering? This is suffering. This is a suffering cycle. This is a process of suffering. We are so caught up in the storylines and the identification and the suffering in itself that we're not even aware of the cause and effect process that is playing out here. And this is what the Buddha was talking about when he talks about karma. Cause and effect. And we often take this view of karma as being like this revenge, justice-based thing. It's going to happen someday. He's going to get his in the end. And I always think of karma as being something much more immediate. What am I doing right now? What causes and conditions am I placing right now? And what effects are they leading to? So if I'm caught up in a whole bunch of storylines and identification around certain things that I want, to the point that I'm not even catching the process of how this is building upon itself, that's my karma right now. I have literal ignorance of what is happening because my head is off somewhere else. I'm not catching how I'm perpetuating this cycle. I'm perpetuating the cycle. It's not happening to me. Feels like it. What I'm doing is causing it. When I talk about karma, what the Buddha taught was the 3 pillars of karma are intention, attention, and perception. I've talked about selective attention. I've talked about misperception. Intention is the central pillar. And what we want to do here is set the intention to focus our energy towards breaking this cycle rather than doing what we're typically doing, which is feeding the cycle. How do we do this? This is where the concept of shatter points comes up, which I talk about occasionally. And for those who have not heard about this before, shatter point is a term that I actually took of all places from a Star Wars novel. It's a book about one of the Jedi who is able to see into the very fabric of existence. And when I say fabric of existence, I don't even necessarily mean just physical objects like a building, but relationships or political situations. He's able to see into these things as if they had a crystalline structure. And he can see the fault lines running throughout. Such that if he wants to make a change to something, he can see where to apply the force most productively to get the desired result. What I have found is if I am banging my head against the wall trying to get something figured out, something done, making something to be other than it is, right? And I'm not having much success. It's not because I'm not putting out enough effort. Lord knows we're all putting out enough effort. It's that we're not putting our effort in the right place. We're not using the right leverage point or shatter point. An example I use sometimes is if you're handcuffed. Are you going to try to free yourself from the handcuffs by trying to destroy the cuffs themselves? Probably not. You might have better luck with the chain linking them. In this case, that would be the shatter point. So what's the shatter point here? Where do we want to focus our energy and attention here so that we can short circuit this cycle that we have been perpetuating unwittingly? Well, I said we get caught up in the content of these storylines and this identification that follows. If we shift our focus from the objects that we have targeted and decided will bring us lasting happiness, if we turn our focus from those storylines to this process itself, the process that I've just described, this cycle, how it is not just doomed to failure, but we can watch it fail again and again and again. We're turning this process inward on itself, like we're holding a mirror up to it. And we don't have to start with something big. We don't have to start with some enormous thing in our lives. We can start very small. I will notice sometimes when I'm out driving and I'm approaching a traffic light and it's green, but I'm a little ways back, and I can tell, oh, it's probably going to turn red before I get there, and I don't want that. And I can feel this clinging. No, stay green, stay green, stay green. Don't waste my time, right? I don't got time for this, right? That's a clinging. There's stress in that. That's a form of suffering. It's a small form. Depending on how much of a hurry you're in, it could be a big form, right? But we can notice, wow, is this helping? What's the storyline around this? What's the identification around this? I don't have time for this. This shouldn't happen to me. And we can see the suffering that is inherent in that clinging. Now, we're not trying to actively talk ourselves out of it, because there's a subtle trap in that. At that point, we can fall into the trap of clinging to not clinging, right? If we try to talk ourselves out of wanting something, then we're really wanting not wanting. So it's not that we're trying to intellectualize this away. We're not trying to talk ourselves into anything. We're simply observing this process of failure and suffering. We're just watching this happen again and again. And what I have found is when we do that enough, disillusionment with the process naturally arises. It's not something we have to talk ourselves into. We just see it over and over again and say, why the hell am I doing this? And it seeps in at a subconscious level. And at that point, we don't have to try to make a change. It just happens. You know, the example I always use is of a hot potato. Somebody hands you a hot potato. Do you sit and think about, okay, well, this is burning my hand. Should I put it down? No, you just drop it. Your body knows enough to just drop it. That's what I found with this. When we watch this process without interference and see what it does, how it plays out, our role in it, when we see it clearly enough, it falls away on its own. The hard part is just making the space for that to keep happening without trying to step in and do something about it. Because we want to fix, right? But that's what got us in this problem in the first place, isn't it? Wanting to fix, wanting things to be other than they are. That craving, that dissatisfaction. That's what got us here in the first place. So it's not going to get us out. So the last thing I'll talk about, and then we'll sit for a bit, is what I have found to be 3 levels of attachment, of clinging in my practice. And this has really shaped the way that I have worked with attachment. Okay? In the process of holding up this mirror to the process, I have found deeper and more subtle nuances, levels of attachment. The most obvious one, the one where I started, was attachment to external things. That relationship, that money, that car, that job, this stuff. I must have that thing to be happy. And of course, we have already talked about why that will never work. But then I started to notice, those things change. And not only do those things change, but my feelings about those things also change. But the feelings of desire, that has a way of kind of feeling the same, regardless of what the target object is. And in particular, what I really want is that feeling of satisfaction. So am I really clinging to this object and that thing and that relationship? No, I'm not. I'm clinging to satisfaction. This desire for satisfaction. I'm clinging to a feeling. So what I'm clinging to isn't out there. What I'm clinging to is in here. Which is another reason why the external stuff will never work. But then I found even a more subtle level than that. And this one really surprised me. After enough practice, and I started getting to the point where things really settled, got really quiet, got really still, I noticed that there were fleeting moments where there didn't seem to be a feeling of clinging, a feeling of attachment. And in those fleeting moments, I felt a desire to cling. A desire to attach. It was like this unfocused grasping. Like if we were reaching out for the railing I was talking about before, but there's no railing there. And we know there's no railing there, but we're grasping anyway. It was like my attention was looking for something to latch onto, like an airplane looking for someplace to land. And I realized, wow, I have an attachment to the process of attachment. Maybe because I'm so accustomed to indulging it. Maybe it's another facet of this being hardwired for dissatisfaction. Perhaps I became dissatisfied with feeling satisfied. Funky, isn't it? Some of the interesting things that we can find in this practice. This is the stuff that we want to be able to see, to tease apart. This is the opposite of those delusions, those misperceptions. This is clear seeing. Now, what we clearly see may still appear to be blurry sometimes. I haven't worked it all through yet. But I'm in a much better place than all the delusions and misperceptions when I started, right? And this gets to the heart of what the Buddha was talking about when he says, we may experience pain and discomfort. You don't have a choice about that. But how we handle pain and discomfort, that's going to affect whether or not we experience suffering on top of pain and discomfort. So when we apply this shatter point of turning our attention onto the process itself, rather than being distracted by the bright, shiny objects, we short-circuit the cycle because we cannot observe the cycle and be perpetuating the cycle at the same time. Let's sit for a few minutes and work with this a little bit, okay? I always like to begin my sittings by imagining I am suspended from the ceiling by a piece of string attached to the top of my head as a way of sitting up straight without adding any extra tension to do so. And if you are feeling any tension right now, that is fine. We can allow tension to be tension. Tension is a process. We may be clinging to the belief that we should not be experiencing tension, especially when we're meditating. I mean, we're here to relax, right? Now, what we're here to do is to observe the process that is here without trying to fix. We're here to shine the light of attention on the process that is here. And if one of those processes is tension, okay, let's see it as it is. And if another one of the processes is this storyline that says, I must get rid of this tension, well, that's also kind of a form of tension, isn't it? And we just see that that storyline is there. Say, okay, there's that thought. I also like to notice what is beneath me, supporting me. Chair, cushion, floor. I feel a sense of grounding. And just take a moment to notice the grounding that is supporting us and the suspension from the ceiling at the top and anything else that happens to be in between the two for us right now, however it is. And if you haven't already, you may begin to bring your attention to your breathing. And our breathing is a place where we often want things to be other than they are. Something that we're trying to fix, particularly in a meditation session. Perhaps we have a storyline that says our breathing in meditation has to be long and deep and contemplative, right? Perhaps we have an identification about how our breathing should be as a meditator. Well, for me, I'm not a meditator. I'm engaging in a process of meditation, and my meditative breath is the breathing process that is happening during that meditation process. And I'm simply bringing attention to it and seeing how it is. And if a thought arises that says, oh, the breath shouldn't be like this, it should be like that, I notice that process as well and say, oh, there's that process. very challenging to watch the breathing without trying to exert some kind of control, some kind of shaping around it. And where's that come from? Some kind of dissatisfaction, some kind of craving, some kind of clinging. Based on a desire or a requirement that, in my experience, does not exist. But boy, we can make ourselves miserable trying to achieve it. And if we feel like we've achieved it, we'll do anything not to lose it. And we can do that with something as simple as the in and out breath. One of the biggest challenges in this practice is often maintaining that focused awareness, that concentration on the breathing process, and not getting carried away by thoughts, daydreams, storylines. Remembering something from the past, thinking about something from the future, running down our to-do list. But remember what I was saying about that third level of attachment, where I found I was attached to attachment. I found myself looking for something to latch onto. And there it is. That's what we're doing. We're latching onto a mental image, a storyline, a memory, a daydream, a fantasy, a task list. And that's going to happen. I mean, if we berate ourselves for allowing that to happen, well, that in itself is another process, another storyline. The point is to see it happening. We're building a skill here, getting a little bit better at catching it, maybe a little faster. Catching what the mind is doing. seeing why the mind is doing what it's doing. Remember, we're clinging to things because we think they're going to bring us happiness. And we want to see, are they? Am I really getting my return on investment here? Am I really focusing my energy in the right place? And I mean, it's your energy, right? You can focus it where you please. But we want to see what we're really getting out of it. So that when we decide where to channel our energy, we're doing it with some reliable information, some wisdom. So we notice the breathing. We notice what might come up in the body, what might come up in the mind. How we react and respond to the things that come up in the body, come up in the mind. What requirements we have for them. What happens when those requirements are met? What happens when those requirements are not met? How long it takes us to form new requirements. What happens when we just watch that all play out? Without trying to fix, without trying to interfere. Just as an observer. Simply shining the light of attention on the process is enough to change the process. because by doing so, we are engaging with it differently. Normally, we are perpetuating the process. So by shining attention on it, focusing our energy there, using that as our shatter point, we are in that moment no longer perpetuating the cycle. We may go back to perpetuating it an instant later, but again, we're building a skill. It's going to take practice, going to take time. But if what we're really looking for, what we've really been chasing as we've been perpetuating this cycle is happiness, then it seems to me that engaging in a process that will actually help reduce our suffering, well, that could be worthwhile. Ironically, that's the thing we've been trying to get all along. Wrap up today's sitting with a passage from an American monk that I study and quote quite often, Thanissaro Bhikkhu. While it's true that the Buddha doesn't say that all sensory pleasures are bad for the mind, still you have to realize that some pleasures work at cross purposes, and every type of pleasure has its price. The price, of course, is not the money that you pay for the pleasure. It's what the pleasure does to the mind, along with what kind of karmic consequences it has. Many pleasures require that things outside be a certain way, and you're not going to be happy unless they are just that way. You find yourself creating a hothouse environment for yourself, and only within that hothouse environment can you be happy. Step outside of it and you can't stand it. Yet we all know about hothouse plants. They're perfectly fine as long as the temperature is just right, the humidity is just right. But if you change anything, they die. That's the way it is with a lot of our pleasures. They require that society be a certain way, that the economy be a certain way, and have reached a certain level of development. When you stop and think about how much your sensual pleasures are dependent on a huge network, a very fragile network, that could break down at any time, you begin to realize that they're pretty scary. To really enjoy those pleasures, you have to forget about that. That's what leads to heedlessness, and you start blocking out huge areas of your awareness, which gets in the way of mindfulness. That's a price you have to pay as well. Thank you, everyone. We'll take a few moments to go through the chat if anyone has any observations or questions. Lana, can I take your husband out for a cuppa? Well, sure, why the hell not? We can do a virtual cuppa, maybe, unless you happen to be somewhere in Massachusetts or some such. Classic second arrow. Yes. Yes, suffering is the second arrow. For those not familiar with the second arrow, when we talk about pain and suffering, suffering is this second arrow, where if you imagine someone who's been shot by an arrow, dude's looking down like there's an arrow sticking in him, and he's like, suffering is like if we're sitting there like, geez, who shot me with this arrow? Why did they shoot me with this arrow? Where was this arrow made? And there's some feathers on this arrow. What kind of bird did these feathers come from? It's like, dude, you're bleeding out, man. Let's tend to the, it's like being shot with a second arrow. So we have this first arrow of pain. The actual issue here, depending on how skillfully we work with that pain, with that discomfort, that determines whether or not we're going to suffer. And if we do not deal with it skillfully, and Lord knows most of us were not raised to deal with pain and discomfort skillfully, which is a whole topic in itself, we're going to cause ourselves suffering. And at that point, yeah, we might have been shot with a first arrow, but now we're just, by somebody else, say. But now we're just shooting ourselves with a second arrow. So yeah, this is classic second arrow. Hey, Michelle. 3 levels of attachment that I found. I think of it as attachment to external things, which again may or may not be a physical object. And then I noticed, well, it's really not about that. It's about attachment to my feelings about them. It's really an inside job. And then after, a number of years, like I said, getting, really reaching some places that were very still, I suddenly noticed I was grasping for grasping. Grasping for grasping's sake. Is that because of a hardwired dissatisfaction? Is it because of sheer force of habit? Is it because of neuroplasticity? The way our brains rewire themselves at a physical level based on our thought processes. So if I'm engaging in grasping over and over and over again, those are the grooves I've worn in, right? Who knows? Maybe a combination. Maybe something I haven't thought of yet. Doesn't really matter so much as the fact that I caught it and was like, oh, wow, holy shit. Because, that was really surprising. Because we think, well, we're trying to work our way towards not being attached, right? And then discovering, wait a minute, I'm feeling an attachment to attachment. Wow, that's bizarre. That was a significant insight for me. And then, of course, the challenge is, well, let me sit and see where this goes. And watch this without, again, trying to fix, trying to talk myself out of it. Because that's really what? Attachment to non-attachment. Right? A hell of a paradox. Hell of a catch-22. How do we not get caught in that trap? Watching. Watching. Because that's a very logical trap. But what we're dealing with here is not really at the level of logic, is it? Because it's illogical as hell. We're dealing with something pre-logic, pre-verbal, something at a felt sense. That's the level we need to understand this at. And that's going to come through a lot of observation, a lot of watching. From Chris, is wanting permanence wrong? If I said yes, would you stop wanting it? Does it matter? It's not about whether it's right or wrong. Is it causing stress and suffering? That's the question. Is it causing stress and suffering? If there's a desire for things to be permanent, which we all have, watch that desire. Watch what you do with that desire. Watch what kind of craving, clinging, identification, storylines, delusion, misperception come up around that desire, are effects of that desire as a cause. Perhaps you might look into how that desire is an effect from another cause. Like, I don't know, maybe dissatisfaction. Something Thanissaro Bhikkhu says a lot. This practice is more about asking the right questions and less about knowing the answers in advance. So you asked a good question, to which I responded with a bunch of questions. And I encourage you to think about those and ask some more of your own. Permanence as safety, or so we believe. Yeah, we have that's why we want things to be permanent, unchanging. We want to achieve a perfect safety. Again, the survival. That's where the dissatisfaction comes from. That's where the mountain of gold being doubled, not being enough for a single person, comes from. We'll never get enough. We'll never get enough. Because we're wired that way. So how do we deal with that? How do we work with that skillfully? How do we work with dissatisfaction? Oh, Chris, you really hit it there. I don't just want to reduce my suffering. I want to reduce my pain. Yep, me too. Let me know how that works out for you. In the wanting to reduce pain, we encounter suffering. There is no pleasure without pain. There are some kinds of pain that sometimes we find pleasurable. They're all sensations, and we're applying labels to these sensations based on our perceptions of them. And our perceptions of them will vary from time to place. Sometimes people don't like being scared, but then go to a horror movie. Interesting. Sometimes we get upset about the fact that we're angry about something, but we also kind of like the anger, right? We suffer because we want to not experience pain. But we want to experience the pleasure, but not the pain. As if that's possible. It's not. It's another delusion. It's a craving. It's a clinging. There's no such thing as constant, unceasing pleasure and no discomfort. Even constant, unceasing pleasure will become uncomfortable after long enough. So how do we skillfully work with that so we don't suffer on top of experiencing our pain and discomfort? All right, I can do just another minute or so. There's great stuff in here, so I hate to have to pull myself away, but let's see where... Anon, I'm a bit of a hothouse plant. Yeah, aren't we all? I'm right there with you. We're probably in the same hothouse. Yeah, it's part of this human condition. Observing the stories in my mind, talk to it, and shift to gratitude. Yeah, that's a huge thing, is the gratitude piece. Whether it's dissatisfaction or, what have you, we can approach them with gratitude, because here's the thing, they're trying to help. That's the really funny thing. All of these things that these aspects of ourselves, these thought processes, these things we might be fighting with, they're trying to help. Because they're all us. They each have a limited vantage point from which they're trying to say, no, you need that to be happy. No, we need that to be happy. No, we need that. But they all want us to be happy because they're all us. We can say thank you. It's like, hey, okay, I hear you. I acknowledge you. We're not going to do what you want to do because that would not be skillful. But thank you for trying and for speaking up. And we leave it at that. So yeah, the gratitude piece is huge. I'll briefly say about, because Anand said here, make peace with nothing is permanent. There is that. In some of the more advanced stuff that the Buddha talks about, when he talks about once we have reached what you might call nirvana, what he sometimes calls the deathless and so forth, he makes reference to that being unconditioned. Or you might actually say permanent. But even that, we can still cling to. So the impermanence in itself is not a problem. We do have to come to grips with the fact that things are impermanent, are inconstant. But even if there was something permanent, we could still cling to that. And even that is suffering. So that gets into another whole topic, but I did want to toss that out there because it's an interesting and important nuance. Yeah, I'll close up with deities here. Acceptance and awareness is the first stage. That's exactly it. There's more to this. I often say, we're not trying to fix, we're not trying to do this. As we get to later stages, we do start to get more involved, if you will. Not that observation is not an involved process, but we do get into a little more actual active manipulation of things. But what I have found is it's really important in the early stages, whether it's in the early stages of our practice or in the early stages of dealing with something new, that we just step back and get the lay of the land. Watch what is playing out, what we're doing with it, and gaining some information, really doing some reconnaissance, if you will. So that when the time comes, and we'll know when the time is right, when the time comes for us to start digging in with it a little more interactively, we're doing so with clear seeing, with some knowledge, with some wisdom, with a clearer awareness. So that's why in most of these sessions, which are really designed to be accessible to everyone of all levels, I really stress the let's not fix. Let's not interfere. Because even that in itself is, ironically enough, a way of starting the fixing process. By stopping. It's just another one of those great paradoxes in this practice. Step one to fixing something. Stop trying to fix the damn thing. Because clearly what you've been doing ain't working. So let's try something else. How about not that? All right. Wow. I definitely have to run. I hope you all have a great rest of the day, evening, and hope to see you all again real soon. Thank you so much, everyone. Cheers.